Hello, I'm James Vanatakis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission. Over the last few weeks, the number one headline has been the new relationship between Australia, the US, and the United Kingdom, the AUKUS trilateral agreement. Now, part of that agreement was the announcement that Australia would have access to nuclear technology for submarines, the next generation of submarines. Now, initially, a lot of people jumped onto that and celebrated it without taking the critical view. The flip side of that was a lot of people jumped up and down and said Australia is giving up its foreign policy, again, without taking a more nuanced perspective. And it's this nuanced perspective, I think, that we're really all after, trying to understand both the positives and the negatives. So today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Associate Professor of International Relations at RMIT University and 2018 Fulbright Scholar, Dr. Aiden Warren, who importantly is also an expert on nuclear non-proliferation. Aiden, thank you so much for joining us. Can we start talking about your research more generally?
Well, basically, in a university context, I'm a associate professor in international relations, political scientist, trained political scientist. My main research interests are in broadly international relations, international security. But if I hone down a little bit into US foreign policy, WMD security, and even a little bit in terms of recent times in the context of emerging technologies and in the context of drones and lethal autonomous weapon systems. So that's sort of my main area. I'm always, and like yourself, I always have a big interest in US politics, domestic sort of movements, and a whole range of things in terms of what's going on there, particularly in the lead up to last year's election and so forth. So that's sort of where I sit in the equation.
Now, let's get into the issue, talking about politics and developments. And something that I suppose surprised a lot of people was the new AUKUS agreement with Australia, UK, and the US. And I think it took a lot of people by surprise. And I think we're still unpacking it. So maybe we can begin by just telling us some of your initial thoughts on the AUKUS agreement.
Well, like a lot of people, I mean, you think you're on top of, or sort of on top of these things. But my reaction was the night before when prominent politicians were being asked to come back to Canberra because there was going to be a significant announcement. So I had all sorts of swirling things in my head in terms of, maybe in relation to China, maybe in terms of potential cyber attack. I didn't have any sort of, I did not foresee there would be something like this coming to the fore. So I had all sorts of things going around my head. And then, of course, with the announcement the next morning, well, I mean, again, I'm still trying to unpack it. And my initial thoughts was, obviously the symbolism, the extent to which is it a new pact? Is it a continuum? Is it building on other things in terms of, the defence white paper from 2017, the strategic defence update of 2020? There's a whole range of things that were swirling through my head. So I pretty much, like yourself and other people, just trying to unpack the issues, what it is about, what does it mean in terms of our region, what does it mean in terms of our alliance and relationship with France, and a whole range of things, even domestically, was ScoMo kind of doing it in terms of, he likes big grand gestures, he likes optics. So there's a whole range of things that were swirling through my head, and I'm still trying to unpack those. So, but very surprised, but in a way, it was a bit of a continuum in there of other things that have gone on in recent times.
Well, in a way, you sort of touched on the issue around the 2017 paper, and so much has changed since 2017.
Yes.
That obviously our relationship with China is dramatically different. In a way, it almost felt like Australia had to make some sort of grand gesture, because it did feel that we were at the mercy of China in some of the decisions that they were making, and our exports industry and our economic security. So, in a way, it was surprising, but I suppose in hindsight, you can always sit there and say, something like this was bound to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, we've been ragdolled. I mean, you could look at it. I mean, obviously, I've seen, Chinese take on Taiwanese students on RMIT soil just in the lead up to COVID. So people have forgotten about that, Hong Kong students, and there's a whole range of other underlying tensions that have been going on at Melbourne campuses and RMIT campuses in the city that I've seen that really are concerning, because I've always looked at the relationship with China quite balanced, but but to get back to your point, there's been a lot of things along the way. You know, I think with Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012-13, that has shifted things. I think that then you throw in, and I think Obama realized that during his second term in office, and then Trump coming to power, and then there's been other things along the way that see it move in the direction which, as you're alluding to, hindsight, you can kind of understand. AUSMIN meetings, or Australian-US ministerial meetings, become more important. They've gradually over the last decade started to mention China. Then we have the 2017 white paper and 2020 Defence Strategic Update. So it does sort of continue on in that regard, but I still think it's another step up, you know what I mean?
So the new agreement obviously involves the US to share nuclear technology. What are some of your thoughts on the ramifications here?
Yeah, it's a really good question, James. I mean, initially, everyone was very clear, like Biden and ScoMo, and everyone was very clear, proponents of the agreement, like big, strong proponents of the agreement, were saying, hey, it's about nuclear propulsion, nuclear power, it's separate, it's not about nuclear weapons on these vessels, because a lot of people, you know, can skew these things in the general public, and that's fair enough. So my reaction was trying to work out, number one, what are the strategic advantages? So obviously it's well documented, these things can go longer underwater, they go to vast distances. Fueling's not really as much of an issue. They can go to strategic chokeholds in the Asia Pacific region. They can go to flashpoints. I mean, obviously the Strait of Malacca, Taiwan if it flares up, South China Sea. So there's a real military deterrent advantage, at least that's what proponents have been saying. My question is, you know, to what degree does it open up the door further to other military connections? What does it mean for us in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? What about in terms of the US Australia 123 agreement? What about the Missile Technology Control Regime? Where do we fit in that? And look, you know, some people have even said to me, you know, they've got conventional weapons on it for the moment, but could they have nuclear weapons down the track? What other military connections is this going to lead to in 10, 15, 20 years down the track, you know, once we open up this sort of, I would argue, significant frontier?
Because that's a really interesting part, isn't it? It was, you know, we're talking about nuclear propulsion technology, which is not a nuclear weapon, but it does, like I said, that technology comes with it with a whole bunch of other things that happen. And you know, already, you know, apart from China, who's raised some concerns, we've seen Malaysia and Indonesia raise concerns. So, you know, obviously important partners for you know, alliances for Australia, especially Indonesia. I mean, do you think there is a risk of you know, even though both the Biden administration and also Scott Morrison as a Prime Minister have both, you know, gone out of their way to say this is not about having a new arms race. I mean, do you have concerns that this is where what it could lead to?
I kind of already think it's underway, James. I think that there's, you know, whether it be emerging technology race, there's a race in terms of who's going to roll out 5G, which has a whole range of military applications. We see China is fastly modernizing. It's been very assertive in its trajectory in the South China Sea, East China Sea, simulations in Taiwan. And I think that is spurring a response from us. I mean, at the same time, again, I'm trying to balance it because I do believe deep down that there is a real assertion and trajectory by China that's concerning for me. But at the same time, well, how do we respond? And so overall, I think that, getting back to your question, I think that there is varying races at the moment going on in terms of technology, 5G. I think that this is part of the equation. And then, of course, we see the hemming. I call it hemming, where we know we've got ANZUS, AUSMIN, Five Eyes, the Quad, AUKUS now, and even TPP was, to me, always strategic. It was never really about trade. It was always about another strategic way of. So there's a whole range of things going on, but I think that this is we're going to start seeing then, therefore, and I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'm just thinking, yeah, what are Malaysia and Indonesia going to do? What are ASEAN states going to do in response to this? We know Australia and Japan, for instance, have declared that they want to militarize more. But there's a whole range of things that are going through my head. But getting back to your question, I'm talking too much. There is a race.
Sort of.
There's varying races that have military connections already underway, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on we've obviously got a cyber security race as well, and we've seen, state and non-state actors, some of them sponsored by state players, sort of militarize that sort of cyber space as well.
Yeah.
So we've seen that, and then there's been concerns about what's going to happen with some of the technology in space. So, the space technologies, and the race to the Mars and beyond, and so so there seems to be this sort of this heating up of events, and I think we're also having conversations that I don't think we've had previously, where we start talking about things like everyone's politely sort of used Thailand as a bit of an elephant in the room, and no one's really talked about it, but now it's openly discussed. What happens if China invades Thailand? What happens if this? What happens if that? And I think that also shows how much we've come to the fore in this space for these complications. So I suppose, one of the other issues, one of the other questions that's followed has been the fact that Australia has no nuclear expertise in this area. So, do you think we have the capabilities to sort of build and service this? I mean, how do you think that part will play out?
That's a really good question, and no, we don't. So we're going to be dependent, particularly as I've understood. There's a lot of questions. Are these nuclear submarines going to be highly enriched uranium, which can obviously be weaponized? What sort of agreements are we going to be connected to that? Are we going to, obviously the US will be the initial supplier of this, but how long will that go for? Will we eventually develop our own indigenous highly enriched uranium facilities and whole the applicable sort of infrastructure to go with that? So those questions really are significant in terms of our obligations with the NPT. And of course, we'll be the only, I think we'll be the only non-nuclear state that will have highly enriched uranium subs. And a lot of people are arguing that that's what will happen, because that's what the UK and US have, so that's been one of the things that have come in equation. So yeah, we don't have the infrastructure as I understand it. I know we're going to be constructing part of these things in Adelaide, but in terms of maintaining them and refueling and maintenance and refurbishing and other things that come into the equation, how will that work down the track? And then what will that mean for other things that come into it? What does it mean? How interconnected are we going to be with the US and further other sort of militarized development and so forth? So there's a whole range of questions that, again, I'm not answering, but I'm throwing out there because there doesn't seem to be too much detail, at least in that regard at this stage.
And I suppose there's a couple of issues that follow there. One is, as it's played out, we've seen in the internal Labor Party politics, with Paul Keating being very critical and sort of saying that Australia's outsourcing has now outsourced its foreign policy to the US because of its heavy reliance. The flip side of that is people saying, well, we don't want to go with these, this was old technology, then we're sort of retrofitting something that it was a bad deal. So, that's beginning to play out in a really interesting way. And I think, but I mean, I suppose one of the criticisms that has come out, and interesting to get your opinion here, because on its own, the idea of having these submarines, it seems, and I'm not an expert in this area, seems like an incredible deal, to sort of have this cutting edge technology, these far superior military machines. Let's not get into the sort of the issue around the risk of another arms race, but let's talk about the deal itself. So it seems like a really great idea, but then other people are saying it's a thin edge of the wedge, and it could lead to Australia moving towards being a nuclear, becoming much more reliant on nuclear. Some people are saying that's a great thing because of climate change and zero emissions, and others are saying actually until you figure out what to do with all the nuclear waste, what do you do now? Now, I suppose, I know some of your work is in non-proliferation. As a sort of someone who works in that area, do you think this is the risk that we're facing now, that we will see a new state such as Australia, who has long abided by the non-proliferation treaty, moving to sort of break away from those commitments?
I think that with this, again, I'm trying to always balance how I talk about this, but I think with this government, definitely so. I think this government is a proponent of, you've alluded to nuclear energy. I think that there's a lot of people discussing the fact that to what degree does this AUKUS agreement soften the Australian populace in relation to accepting nuclear energy and being open. You know what I mean? Like, Australians going through a very conservative phase at the moment. We only have to see the sort of populism and so forth, and even responses to COVID and so forth. I mean, again, but I think we need to acknowledge that. But I think that this is a softening. I think it is an entree into other things that may come. We know that the United States and Russia left the INF Treaty, and when I was in DC, there was a lot of discussion about, hey, well, why are we leaving the INF Treaty? And then the argument was, well, 60-70% of China's weapons are in the INF range, and the United States wants that flexibility, but where are they going to possess those? We're going to house those weapons. Australia was mentioned in many conversations. So I'm just saying to you, from this starting point, again, I'm not trying to be alarmist, but this starting point, I can see it segue into other particular areas in terms of nuclear energy, or maybe even having a suite of weapons, you know, in 5 to 10, 11, 12 years down the track that maybe are gauged towards China. I would never say never in terms of that sort of realm. So there's a whole range of things that do concern me, that this is a kind of an entree potentially.
If I may, Aiden, I think your internal conversation seems to be capturing the broader mood of the Australian public. That is, it's I think people are both, you know, like you said, because of the various races that are happening, and you know, the rise of China and some of the issues around free movement and so on. Obviously this is opening up. People are quite positive about the potential here, but at the same time incredibly wary. So it's this kind of, it's one of those deals that I think we'll be unpacking. I mean, when we get away from the headlines, we'll be unpacking it for a long time to come.
It's really, I'm finding this probably one of the most difficult issues I've had to deal with, because I do personally believe that China's assertions and trajectory is concerning for me. You know, going against the Hague decision in terms of, you know, a couple of years back, and picking and choosing when they participate in certain international conventions and norms and so forth, and there's no doubt that those militarized islands in the South China Sea are concerning. They're dormant atolls built up, and now are really militarized structures. Their coast guard is, you know, undertaking all sorts of nefarious activities, grey zone attacks on various other actors. And even when Biden was leaving Afghanistan and caught up in all the, you know, and rightly so, hoopla surrounding that, made clear pronouncements that any sort of external vessels have to declare to China in advance. And it kind of got washed under the carpet a little bit, that you have to declare that you are coming into those waters, those disputed waters. So, and then of course those military simulations that I talked about in terms of Taiwan. A lot of people I know in DC argue that they think Taiwan's going to be the biggest trigger, whereas most people have been thinking it's the South China Sea in terms of any sort of conflict. And so I have to acknowledge that that's real, but I'm trying to balance that with my sort of views on the matter, and trying not to put our eggs too much into the sort of the I suppose the US basket, if that, you know, and overcommitting and really overcommitting ourselves to a real firm deterrence. So I'm trying to balance that like many other people are, and I hope I'm not sounding like I'm sitting on a fence. I'm still trying to work it out.
Oh, look, I think, there's look, when it comes to these things, I think until we unpack it and get a real picture of what's going on, sitting on the fence is not a bad place to be, because we still don't understand, you know, the intricacies as they're unpacking. And like I said, I think initially a lot of people, myself included, are really, really positive, but we're still trying to come to terms with with, you know, the issue around nuclear technology, the impact of the region, and so on. And you know, and also the other thing, and I'll ask you as well about our relationship with France. I mean, this has taken obviously had quite a negative impact with France, and possibly, you know, with you know, we've got closer to the UK, but the UK has now left the European Union. So do you think in a way, you know, has this in a way made us more vulnerable to, you know, or do you think it has sort of made us more secure? Like, where do you think we'll end up? Or you're also still trying to work through that?
No, but it's a good question. It's an excellent question. It's right. I mean, like a lot of people argue, and part of me thinks that we're with the world's #1 superpower, even though there's a lot of declinist debates. We've got access to not only submarines, we can have sharing technology in terms of AI, cyber, underwater capabilities, a whole range of other things that have kind of been parked to the side while most have been discussing the submarines. So there is that proponent. We've bumped ourselves up to another level inside the tent where we can really have a firm deterrent. We may be able to deter China from thinking or rethinking their certain maneuvers in the region. So there is that argument. It definitely has merit to it. And as we've both discussed, there's a lot of continuum in this. It's not like it's come out of the woodwork. We go back to Osmin statements. We go back to the white papers. So there has been things, indicators in that regard. I think that in terms of France, it was clumsy. It's, France is still a formidable power. It's part of the UN Security Council. They were blindsided. We gave assurances even not that long ago that everything was going okay. I'm reading all sorts of different things. And so my view in relation to that, it was a really backhanded slap to them diplomatically. There will be political and economic consequences, I'm sure, because we're trying to work out a free trade agreement with the EU, which is France, of course, is part of that equation. But it was clumsy. And also, remember, France has a pretty healthy history in terms of the Indo-Pacific. I think we collaborate in terms of our navies and so forth. So again, it's very messy in the falling out of what will happen in the context of France, but doesn't make it safer. I think ultimately we've definitely made the decision. This is where it's at. We've been moving that direction. We've been trying to hedge for many years in terms of balancing US and China. We've clearly showed our hand now. We're stepping up the ante. We're going to the firm deterrent route.
Fantastic. And look, just one final question. Part of the AUKUS discussions was having to step up in other areas such as vaccines, and I suppose where Australia and the US and specifically do have a lot of advantages is the potential for soft power diplomacy, which some have argued they haven't taken advantage of over the last few years. They've dropped the ball, which has allowed China to sort of come in with Belt and Roads and other initiatives. I mean, do you think? I mean, how important is it for Australia and the US and the UK as well, but the AUKUS alliance to kind of pair all this kind of higher level, agreements that involve the nuclear technology, to pair that with some serious and real soft power diplomacy, be it COVID vaccines or other opportunities that they need to take to ensure happen?
Look, I would like to see more of those soft power initiatives, as you allude to. COVID, we need to get underdeveloped countries and developing countries vaccinated if we really are going to get out of the woods with this. And I'd like to see something which is far-fetched. I know it won't happen in terms of AUKUS, but in terms of showing some real initiatives in relation to the environment and climate change. I would like to see something more coherent and holistic in that regard. So it's not just about the military and deterrence and the sharing of technology and us having access to these high level and sophisticated munitions, but also moving in that other direction. If we want to move up a little bit further, which this suggests to me a bit above being just a middle power, then I think we need to make some of these other commitments, as you're alluding to, in the region, into in the context of vaccines, because that if I put in the security domain, it's health security, and unless we get people under control in that regard, then we can't move forward in any sort of shape or form moving forward. Fantastic.
Well, look, I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time. I think it's
time, James.
It's really great. What I've really enjoyed about this conversation is the fact that as we unpack things, we're still coming to terms about where it sits, and it's easy to sort of jump to one side and sort of just boost it without seeing the negatives, or just be really critical instantly of everything. But I think as we begin to unpack it, I think we do need to be cognizant of the advantages as well as the risks that come with it. And I think following that more, I suppose, subtle and nuanced analysis is where it's at. So thank you so much for your time. I really
Anytime,
appreciate
James.
it.
And it's great to talk, and I think we could talk for longer if we wanted to. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good on you.